All right, and here we go. So we'll pick up where we left off. There is not a lot to do in this particular. Hey, thanks. Jeez, crackers. Goodness. I could have said something else. I'm trying to be. We don't like to swear in the house because of the dog. We don't want him to pick up bad habits. Yeah, because he'll start barking. Ruff, ruff. Yeah. Can you imagine that with a dog? Okay. This is where we left off. This is about resistance, and resistance is real. And then we're going to go back to the other PowerPoint from the Cowan textbook. It's got some interesting stuff in there as well. Just to kind of kick it around. You got the study guide, right? I haven't figured this out yet. We have a whole chapter to do. Do not get overly excited. I'm thinking about doing this test on Blackboard. Don't. Not a word. Bribery will help. Because we got so much stuff to cover. Do not. The final will be on site. You're stuck here. But it's an opportunity. Possible. I'm thinking about it. Not convinced. Boy, you're so noisy too. I never hear from someone. Moving on. Okay, so this is the whole idea. I talked about this a little bit. We use a lot of vancomycin erroneously for gastrointestinal problems. You know, people in hospitals get diarrhea a lot. And unfortunately, and what they were doing, they were using vancomycin anyway to treat staphylococcal infections. They were using it to treat gastrointestinal infections. And effectively, they created a monster. And they basically, because the enterococci, which is a bear to treat anyway, to had a particular plasmid that we call R plasmids, which means they carry resistance to other antibiotics or to antibiotics. And that one can transfer not just in the same species to other microbes. And we think that's how we started to develop vancomycin resistance in Staphylococcus aureus. That's a superbug. I mean, you're starting to run out of ways to treat Staph aureus, which is the most common infection that we deal with, basically, if you want to look at all the infections that we have. Which, particularly for skin and wound infections, is by far and away the most common. If I call it public enemy number one. So that's, and that was one, and these are just some of the things that kind of are the background of all of these problems that are there. Here's Staph aureus. Okay, very common cause for healthcare associated. That means in the hospital. When you say hospital or HA or healthcare or hospital associated, again, more difficult to treat than the ones in the community. You can see how community acquired versus healthcare acquired. Okay. And I mean, this is all because, again, we don't treat it initially with vancomycin, as you might see them referring to here. So very common. They're resistant to penicillins. They have penicillinase. Now the strains have recently emerged that have very low affinity to all of the beta-lactam drugs, including methicillin. So that's MRSA in a nutshell. And again, they're trying to manufacture in the laboratory what we call semi-synthetic forms of cephalosporins or other penicillins in an effort, and some of those newer drugs I was talking to you about, in an effort to try to fight MRSA. I mean, this is, and again, what we're seeing, what you're reading in this PowerPoint is a good 6 to 8 years old by this time. They're due for a new edition of Nestor, which is this textbook, and and even when you see a book, or you see the PowerPoint sequence from a book, it's probably at least 4 years old by that time. By the time it's published and all that, it takes a while. So the statistical data is not quite current. So here's the HA-MRSA, very wide. And it used to be, you might say that used to be true, and I think it's still to some extent true in nursing homes. But hospitals are being a little bit more cautious, as I was telling you about this. So very, very strict guidelines have been used because we're seeing what they call Visa and Versa. And these are the ones where the community acquired ones, as I told you, those combination sulfa drugs, those folic acid inhibitors like Bactrim and Septra, which are so readily affordable and generally very easy to tolerate, comparatively speaking, have taken over. This is a new one on the map. For years, penicillins, almost any kind of penicillin, even the very basic penicillins, could treat strep pneumonia, the number one cause of bacterial pneumonia. When you get a viral infection, if you get the flu, the big problem that puts people in the hospital and can kill them is bacterial pneumonia, secondary bacterial pneumonia. And so now we're starting to see changes in that. We're having to use a more diverse array of antibiotics that are, and so as we start to see resistance in these, and then effectively, the Enterobacteriaceae, you've heard me say it before, as a term you probably should remember going forward. I'm not going to put it for you on a test, but that's E. coli, all the gut bacteria. And the problem with gut bacteria, like I said, people in hospitals are incontinent frequently. They have catheters frequently. It's easy for contamination from incontinence, from soiled areas in their clothing and in the bedding, to get on wounds, to get on skin. They are a real pain in the neck to treat. And diabetics are particularly predisposed, even if they're at home. It's not hard to contaminate something. We know that they're gram-negatives to the outer membrane. Yes, there's some have developed now. This is when we're talking about their ability to produce beta-lactamases. So they challenge us trying to use Staphylococcus and similar organisms. And so this is the so-called ESBLs that I mentioned to you in passing. Extended spectrum beta-lactamases resisting a lot of cephalosporins. Years ago, we used to do something called aztreonam. Don't use it so much anymore. So that has really become, that's a real issue. And now the CRE, this carbapenem resistant strains are found. These were, again, a drug of last resort. They were in that cell wall antibiotic category. I'm not going to ask you about it, but depending on where you're going, career-wise, a lot of what I give to you is to help you. You're going to understand you're just not going to do textbooky stuff. They're going to ask you going forward in nursing to look at research studies, to read articles, and you're going to see a lot of this terminology. So I'm trying to acquaint you with this going forward, okay? Because you're in this program particularly, it doesn't stop so easily there. There's a lot. You have to be able to look at the nursing literature, look at the studies, look at how they were done. There's a lot of information here that's very important going forward. So again, it's not stuff that I'm going to sit here and have you remember what a CRE is versus an ESBL, but to understand, that this is information that's important going forward. And then tuberculosis, a real problem. So there are so many cells that are involved. It's very easy to develop resistance. It's very hard to treat in any event. Typical treatment, minimum 6 months, typically a year. And you have to rotate drugs. And we classify it based on how severe it is, which way, if it's resistant to specific agents by testing. Typically, they do sputum cultures for this. So they classify as multi-drug and extensively drug resistant. We'll talk more about tuberculosis. Our next topic, not this coming chapter, is sort of about how diseases spread, the damage that they do, some epidemiology terms. And I think it's important, at least for my lab, not this coming week, but in 2 weeks, we do a hand washing lab for all the labs. And I don't know whether or not Dr. Dress is going to do it in his labs. I do something called the synthetic epidemic, which is how we basically artificially create an epidemic spread by a chemical, without you having to touch anything, certainly. And to give you an idea how rapidly diseases spread. So I think that's a very, very interesting exercise, I think. So all of that, that's where the relevance is of starting to understand the severity of these things. Okay. And this is pretty much standard, all of those things. What we tell people, we have to identify things. We have to use the suitable. We can't, that shotgun therapy we used to call it, give it a powerful antibiotic. I want my patient to get better. That's fine to start, but based on the culture and sensitivity, you should use the specifically best choice agent. Okay, the narrower the spectrum for treating something, the better it is, because you're more likely to get rid of it and not create resistance to it. And so, and this education, if there was people clearly most responsible, you've all seen how every doctor is ridiculously busy. I've lived that life. You go into the room, oh yeah, monsieur, I have this, you've got 25 patients waiting in your office. You just did 2 operations. You got 3 people in the hospital. You're going on rounds. You got residents yelling at you. And you patient, oh yeah, we're taking care of you. We're discharging you this morning, and they're going to come in here and tell you exactly what you have to do. Here's a prescription. Everything went well in surgery. Boom, out the door. So who's going to tell them, okay, here's what you have to take this medicine. You have to take it under these conditions. You can't, because you start to feel better, don't stop taking it. A pain pill I can buy, not taking it. But everything else you got to take to fulfillment. And that's part of the reason you have to maintain adequate blood levels. I'm saying, and typically what happens, it's easy to, some bacteria are easy to kill. It's the ones that survive the initial onslaught of antibiotic therapy that develop this resistance. And I mean, you can see it say here, that's you in nursing. That's you in healthcare. Educate, politely but firmly is the way I would describe it. You're just hoping that you get a reasonable degree of compliance, those types of things. And some people you have to frighten a little. You'll figure it out. You have to a certain extent, you need to be able to read people to a certain extent, and not everybody's good at it, but you'll figure it out. So educating the public, yeah, we don't get antibiotics we don't use for a cold, blah, 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 blah. Read through this if you want. Here are antimicrobial drugs used in animal foods at low levels to enhance growth. Select for drug-resistant microbes. So these are some of the things that we're starting to see. This is when you start to see that's sort of the drive for organic agents and antibiotic-free, sourcing of, whether it's chicken, whether it's whatever. And a lot of that, even though it's desirable, is based on budget as well. Yeah. Oh, you have to go buy cage-free eggs. I mean, right? You probably have to take a loan these days for some of those things. Understand that. So So I think, particularly if you're dealing with patients and they say, look, I can't, sometimes you have trouble affording all the things you have them to do or taking off time off work. There's all sorts of parameters that you have to consider sort of in treating. Which brings us to antivirals. I don't want to go crazy. Okay, when we talked about viruses, I spent a little but not a lot of time, and that's really, viruses are different. Antibiotics is a cell. We can attack the ribosome. We can attack the cell wall. We can attack the membrane if we wanted to. We can attack DNA and RNA. Viruses, we can't. Because the problem with viruses, number one, they grow in our cells. So in order to get the medicine in there, we have, at the very least, most of the time, we're going to cause some degree of damage to our cells. They're already in there, so we have to have something that can get inside of our cells and then realistically work on this. And realistically do something to stop this cycle. This is the cycle. And this is what happens. First, they enter. But to enter the cell, they have to attach to a receptor. They're brought into the cell. They have to uncoat. That's a unique mechanism. So it shouldn't surprise you that the earliest antivirals were agents to stop uncoating, stopping enzymes inside your cell or my cell from breaking apart that protein shell. The trouble was they worked, but and the only disease we had them for was influenza, and if you didn't start treating it early, they didn't work. So we don't see a lot of uncoating agents. Entry agents are getting pretty popular. Okay, if we can stop it from attaching. Number one on the hit parade, there are no naturally occurring antiviral agents. There are no if you wanted to use the term antiviral antibiotics, it is a misnomer. There are none. These are all created in the lab. Problem number one. Number two, they don't prevent. Okay. Prevention would indicate they don't allow the virus to get you. That's what immunizations are for. That's from previous exposure to disease are for. All of those kinds of things. Can they prevent recurrences? Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, particularly when you start talking about herpes viruses. So there are no antibiotics in this category. Okay, it's not, it's made by viruses that attack other viruses. Interferon is a substance that's not in this category because it's something that our cells make in an effort to combat viruses as part of our natural defenses. So that really doesn't fall into this category that are there. So any antivirals only work once you're infected. You have to have been infected at least one time. The vast majority of them work here. The vast majority of these work in around the area of assembling, basically the reproduction, making either DNA or RNA, putting it back together, that type of stuff. Most of those agents, I mentioned the term before when we looked at folic acid, they're what are called analogs, lookalikes. And typically they are analogs to either DNA or RNA, nucleic acid bases, those nitrogenous bases, the A's, the T's, the C's, all those guys. So effectively, they are similar to them chemically, structurally, and they have something on them that makes them toxic, makes them not work. In other words, doesn't allow the RNA or the DNA to be assembled appropriately. And not only is this the hallmark of antiviral therapy, this is really the hallmark of cancer chemotherapy. Most of the time, we use base analogs, lookalike drugs. So they've been, and this was the earliest line of treatment for viruses. The first, you'll see the name of it, maybe not, you'll probably see it a little bit here, but the first time we saw this being utilized was when they started to treat HIV, and that was AZT. So it's azithromycin. It looks a little bit like thymine. It wasn't terribly effective, but that was one of the early treatments that was being used in the very, very early days of the HIV/AIDS thing that was going on. So there's a lot there in regard to it. So we'll look at a lot of these different things that are part of it as well. Then, once we've replicated all those things, we basically have to go through an assembly process. So we can interfere with that, and as well, we can interfere with how it exits the cell. So basically, we have agents that we try to stop it from entering. Not so successful with uncoding. Fairly successful in this area, making either RNA or DNA. Somewhat successful in how we basically, remember, it's like an assembly line, how we assemble them, and fairly successful in preventing them, because if they can't leave or leave effectively, they can't infect other cells. Unfortunately, these days we're limited in ones so where do we have effective agents? What viruses? Influenza, HIV, herpes, and I would add another one because of recent success, hepatitis C. Other than that, not a whole lot of successful agents. So it's been very, very limited. Okay, there wasn't a whole lot of demand for these things. Well, again, what stimulated the demand was effectively HIV. And you might remember me telling you about something called the Orphan Drug Act from 1988, where it gave financial incentives to pharmaceutical companies to make antivirals specifically for HIV. Orphan didn't have anything to do with orphans. Orphan meant that these were diseases, not like influenza that affects so many of us. I read a very, very interesting article. It's like a blurb on one of the news sites. They discovered a new antibiotic. And I forget, I worked on protein synthesis. I'll have to look up the article. And the question was, and then the most interesting part was not that they had found this. What they said at the end about pharmaceutical companies, why they haven't, now that it's been, what are the plans going forward? Is this another antibiotic we could be using, given all resistance and MRSA and blah, blah, blah. The reason pharmaceutical companies don't want to make more antibiotics, there's not enough profit. There's a whole lot more profit in making vaccines than every time we sneeze. I know that's me editorializing, but I think you get the point. The profound statement in a news article on also like CNN's website, one of those, well-read website, basically said the pharmaceutical companies do not find that much profit in making antibiotics. Don't think for a minute. You'll find this out when you get. My first wife was the wound care nurse for her 125 bed, as well as being a supervisor, 125 bed nursing home. Okay, so pharmaceutical company wants you. Wound care products are expensive. All the advanced wound care, the dressing materials, the things you put on them, none of them are cheap. Okay, every company wants you to use them. The company took her and a bunch of other wound care nurses from large nursing homes and other similar facilities out to dinner. Where did they? They didn't go to McDonald's for dinner. They went to Ruth Chris Steakhouse, and then, which ain't cheap, by the way. And then on the way out, when they got to desserts, after and they're having cocktails and all that stuff. I think he said, if you'd like to order a dessert, go ahead, take it home if you're not hungry. And I think my wife said, well, how many can I order? He goes, I don't care if you order them all. I got the company credit card. They want you to use their products. There's a lot of financial incentive for certain things. And that's understand the business of healthcare and how much education you get here, I do not know. Don't mean to be jaded about this or anything like that, but the reality is there's a business aspect to it. Moving on. So as you can see here, the entry inhibitors are relatively new, and that's something they're starting to use for HIV. Uncoating, I don't think they're using. As you can see, these two were originally there. You don't have to worry about the names of mantidine and rimantadine. Again, why don't we use them? Because if you don't, and a lot of people, it's by day 3 or 4, they finally go to the doctor and say, oh my God, I got the flu. And by that time, it's probably too late to use those that are there. These nucleic acid synthesis ones, they've got fancy names, nucleoside analogs, non-nucleoside polymerase inhibitors, blah, 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 blah. Most of these are for HIV, and the best of all of these, it's not for HIV, it's interestingly, it's for herpes. The family, as you will see shortly, are the acyclovirs. Typically, antivirals have the last name generically vir for virus, VIR. You've heard of it. Valacyclovir is Valtrex. Why is this such an efficient? Because the big problem, as I said when we started talking about this, is the problem with these antivirals, they affect your cells too, because they have to get inside the cell. The interesting thing about the acyclovir family and Valtrex specifically, it's activated by an enzyme that's only found in cells that have been invaded by the herpes virus. That gives it selective toxicity. It doesn't affect your other cells unless they have a herpes infection inside them, unless they have a herpes virus being made. That's a winner. That's a big winner. And yes, from a prevention standpoint, they work on people. Let's say someone had got genital herpes, which is unfortunately very common and not very pleasant to have. And you can prevent recurrences. There's evidence for taking it on a regular basis to prevent it from recurring. There's evidence to suggest if it does recur, that this will shorten it, will shorten the duration of it. So in that, people say, well, that's a preventative. Yeah, but if someone you were having unprotected intercourse with did not have, they couldn't take this and avoid getting it if they had never been infected by herpes virus. That's a preventative. I mean, then you have to rely on barrier and other methods that are part of it. Yes, ma'am.
Even though they're not living, but they still have genetic material, are they going to develop any resistance?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah. If you're interfering with those mechanisms, you're going to cause irregularities, and they'll manifest themselves as mutations. That's why, for instance, it's HIV would be the classic example. Years ago, we had what's called the triple cocktail. You used a minimum of 3 antivirals. So if it's an RNA virus, they mutate anyway. So imagine, now herpes is a DNA virus, it's probably less likely. But imagine an RNA virus now, like HIV, now there's 4. It's like a quadruple cocktail, typically given in one pill on a regular daily dosage. It's been very effective. That's one of the good things about HIV, if there is such a thing as being a good thing. At least we have reliable treatment. People live with HIV for a lifetime. By definition, it's not fatal. C1 Magic Johnson. And this is now, for the better part of 35 years, he's been HIV positive. I mean, is he physically fit? Does he get the very best of health care? Does he have any problem acquiring the medicines? None of, perfect example of someone who can live a full life with this. It's very interesting. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, the likelihood we haven't been able to solve the resistance problem, in short. And now this production, these are some of the things and you see it mostly for HIV. Okay, we have something called protease inhibitors because they form what's called a polyprotein, a very long strand that basically protease is an enzyme that comes with the HIV that chops it, the little components so they can be assembled. But this is one that helps a lot. Remember influenza, and we'll see this again when we look at respiratory. Remember, we categorize them as H and N's, H1N1, H5N1, H5. The entry, the marker, those protein spikes, the H spike facilitates its entry in a respiratory cell. The N spike, the neuraminidase, as you can see it down here, the neuraminidase facilitates its exit. Neuraminidase inhibitors have been very effective. Again, you have to use them early on. So you've heard their names, Tamiflu and Relenza. They work. I mean, if you're 7 days into the flu, they're not going to work. And understand that it's based on this is cool. Every flu has its own little sort of clinical setup. They're not all, oh my God, my goodness, it has to be this, that, or the other thing. But it's the same thing with colds. You see what's going around, how people present. They start with the sore throat, they start with the runny nose, etc. And all of a sudden, clinicians get a picture of what's going around. And so, come in and have that. Influenza is very interesting in regard to that. So a lot of the scientists are trying to develop these drugs that interfere with the viral replication. They're very, very limited, and none eliminate latent infections. Every so often you'll see an article in the medical literature saying we were able to remove HIV. Someone who's formerly HIV positive is now testing HIV negative. It's not because their immune system has collapsed, which would be an explanation for that. Theoretically, they no longer, that HIV, they're cleared of that virus. They are few and far between, and there's really no long-term follow-up on them. That would be the ultimate goal. If you found something that typically they're trying to reverse engineer it, trying to resequence the cell in some way, shape, or form so it doesn't work. I suppose it's interesting, and again, I think the demand for it is because there's availability of funding for it more than anything else. That's there. And they go through all of these, and these are some of the names like that ACT. Again, and it can show you what they are. So it's not just limited to these things. Acyclovirs, and that's the one, the Valtrex, and that's valacyclovir, acyclovir. My daughter took that, and she got viral meningitis. They were sure about 4 or 5% of viral meningitis is herpetic. In other words, it came from herpes. Imagine it's like a cold sore, and rather than showing up like on her lip or her gum, went the other direction. So she ended up in the hospital with that, with headache, stiff neck, fever. Fortunately, they were able to diagnose it, at least based on her clinical appearance. They did this spinal tap to make sure it wasn't bacterial. They treated her. They sent her home on oral agents. And then 2 days later, I'm getting a call. I was teaching up at BC3, and I'm getting yelled at for having. They're weird up there. Having my cell phone on because I knew my daughter wasn't well, and I had to write I had to leave there to go get my granddaughter at the time in grade school. This is a long time. It's 15 years ago or so. She was just, she's like 8 or 9 years old. You're not supposed to have your cell phone in class. Hey, you go get my granddaughter if they let you. I had a few unkind words for them. Probably why I didn't work there now. But I digress. Moving on. So she ended up going back on intravenous acyclovirs, and in about 2 days she was out again, and they gave her a longer course orally. They had just, the error was she was clinically looked better, but it didn't sustain that, and she had to go back in. It's thankfully these work fairly effectively. So HSV, herpes simplex, this has been a very useful treatment for chickenpox and particularly for shingles. For years, we were in big trouble with shingles. My biggest problem treating shingles patients, getting them off pain pills. It's extraordinarily painful. This has been a godsend for that kind of thing. So I mean, there's a lot of interesting little side notes about that. So I wanted to give you an idea. Here are I forget. I think this one's Tamiflu and this one's Relenza, but I'm not going to ask you that. Again, protease inhibitors are all about HIV. The HIV, we'll look at it a little bit more when we look at sexually transmitted disease. What it does is because it's an RNA virus that becomes DNA, it joins with your helper T cells DNA, and we call that genome integration. This tries to stop that. So there's a lot of it. All of it's based on understanding how viruses replicate and what they do once they're inside of you. Okay, and so entry inhibitors, uncoating agents, and you can read through this. I'll be very specific on what's going to be. There's probably maybe 4 or 5 questions tops on antivirals on this exam. Okay, one of them will be on the neuraminidase inhibitors like Relenza. Another one will be on Valtrex. You can pick them out now. Okay, the disease they work on: HIV, influenza, okay, herpes, hepatitis C is really comparatively new, but they're having a lot of success. A lot of people had hidden hepatitis C, and it was very difficult to treat. Now there's much more effective treatment for people who have been exposed to it. I told you my first wife was exposed to it either from a transfusion back in '81 or from a blood spatter in 2004. Doesn't matter either way, but I mean, that's once you have it, you have it. And there really wasn't a lot of treatment. And my kids were very, very worried because her health, she's in a hospital now waiting for a placement. She fell out of bed and hit her head last week. Got a concussion in her apartment. So she isn't terribly healthy or terribly strong, fortunately. And you can see cytomegalo, remember that's in the herpes family. So we have some treatment that's available. And they go through all of these things that are there. So you can read through this. This is more information you need that are there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they go through all of these types of things that are there. But for fungi, very straightforward. The whole ball game with fungi, and I mentioned this before, is targeting ergosterol. Basically, that makes the membrane. Even though they have a cell wall, okay, if we can destabilize the membrane, it's effective treatment. For years, again, coming from Streptomyces, that soil bacteria where we get a lot of things from, like streptomycin and erythromycin, these were a real problem because it was very toxic to humans. That's the one that when I was in school, that was really we had a very limited choice intravenously, and they only used that for people who were where you were trying to save a life, because you were going to have, they were either going to lose their hearing or some other big problem was going to occur, and that's decision making in medicine 101. There's that, the whole idea, first do no harm. I mean, you have to tell people this is what could happen. These azoles they do have side effects, but the azoles and the oleolamines have been significant. We have some of them work orally, which has been my favorite again is diflucam by far and away, which is fluconazole. Some of them we just use topically. So when you buy an antifungal cream, that's generic at Giant Eagle or at Walmart or Walgreens, wherever you would go. They're either going to be in this category, one called terbinafine, which is an oleoamine, or the other one will be called clotrimazole or miconazole. And that kind of tells you their names that are there. Okay. And I don't go crazy about this either because it's something, it depends on what you're going to be doing. Years ago, cells, you might remember cells divide. This a long time ago, going back to AP1. They formed that spindle. The spindle is made out of microtubules. The trouble is, lots of cells divide. This was the agent we used a lot of, and it has a greater uptake by fungal cells. I'll buy that. This caused it caused autoimmune phenomena. Some people it induced something called systemic lupus erythematosus, which we'll be covering for those who are unfortunate enough to have me in A&P. We'll be covering that a little bit, and perhaps even today. Surely by this week. You don't have to thank me. It's okay. And who knows? Maybe we'll have more than 6 people show up. Friday was bad. You guys were there. I was impressed. Yeah, not your next door neighbor, not your right hand girl. We know it's selective type. She has selective attendance. Oh, don't smile and look like that. Why do I have to deal with students? And again, this is when we're looking at the agents, the ones that are important here. Okay, malaria. Normally, there are some new agents that are coming along. This has been, the quinolones have been the primary. They're derivative. They're from the quinine alkaloids from plants that were discovered. You might remember me telling you about when not discovered, but were made aware of when the natives made us aware of in Panama when the Panama Canal was being dug or being made, however, and dug is the term that I use for that. So they are very useful. They're in general, the mechanism is not clear. Okay, what's interesting about malaria is because it affects hemoglobin. Folks who have sickle cell disease don't get malaria because their hemoglobin is altered. It's not the same. So I mean, it's interesting how you can get having one thing might preclude getting something else, particularly on a genetic basis. And so they're in that. And remember the metronidazole, the one that does not, metronidazole used to treat infections caused by anaerobic bacteria and organisms and activated by the metabolism of anaerobic organisms. Very, very useful. So these are agents, and I like to point out those ones that do double duty. And there's a couple of antibiotics, tetracycline, streptomycin. I mean, a lot of them have particularly activity on anaerobes that are there. I don't really do any of this with regard to the worms. The ivermectin was very interesting because people were all up in arms about, oh my God, someone's using horse paste to treat COVID, which actually worked. As long as you use a small dose, but again, now you're getting into pharmaceutical companies, vaccines, government mandates. It's. I would optimally like to be in an age where the public can be reliably informed and know that their sources of information do not have an agenda. I'm trying to say that politely. Voila. So back to the other. How we do? Oh, we're good. We got 10 minutes. I can cover that. Happy dance. So this is Cowan. And so I had done the fungal unit with you before and had stopped there. Similarities between fungal and human cells mean that a lot of times there are problems for us. But again, those ergosterol ones, at least that's the most reliable to try to combat that sterol that stabilizes their membrane. They give you the names that are there. I mean, so there's a lot of these. You can read through this. I mean, topically, clotrimazole and miconazole work very, very well. That would be one of those applicators for like vaginal yeast infections, which are so terribly common and certainly not problematic. And we revisit them again. We do sexually and non-sexually transmitted urinary tract infections. Here's the quinine, okay, for hundreds of years, okay. There's no single drug that's universally effective for this. This is again, they're not 100% sure how this works. This is a relatively new agent I'm unfamiliar with. So if you're in an area, it depends. I mean, if, for this, yeah, again, the students just came back from Ecuador. Whether that, I don't know if it's pretty high up. I don't know if mosquitoes are such a big problem. When when Dr. Ross did the trip to Nicaragua, mosquitoes are a problem. If you have mosquitoes, malaria is part of the picture. So I do not know what was there. I mean, check with him. He would be very familiar with that and happy to talk to you, I'm sure. So the metronidazole, very, very useful for intestinal infections, even ones that have impact on the liver. My kids had to take this because they had, from well water, they got giardia when they were little. I mean, it wasn't a pleasant experience, certainly, but they tolerated it very well. Like I said, it comes as a liquid, so children, even adults, if you're, like, I'm bad with pills. I need a lot of water. I'm happy to crunch it up, put it in my applesauce. Or better yet, chocolate pudding. Mary Poppins. Spoonful of sugar. Just shove. Nobody, and you can see some of the antibiotics have aspect. And, sorry, not doing it. And here's their unit on antivirals. So again, prevention is, we talk about vaccines, okay? And again, the limited amount, HIV/AIDS, influenza, the common cold does attest the need for more effective medications. It's a cold, everybody. It's not going to kill you. Don't get me started. That's why they call it a cold. And you can see here they are, the oseltamivir, Tamiflu, zanamivir, Relenza. So you can look through all of those kinds of things that are there. And this is the same unit with regard to drug resistance. Can be intrinsic as well as acquired. Typically, the acquisition is from plasmid transfers. Those are those lateral transfers that are there. I mean, look at as early as we started to use penicillin, resistance started to work. Okay, and then why we started to see it dramatically then, I remember being, again, at the Vets Hospital in 76, where they were talking about resistance then. And they're switching people over to cloxacillin and oxacillin and not being successful. We didn't know it was MRSA, but it started to rear its ugly head then. It only got worse. Acquisition of entire new genes by horizontal transfer, those are plasmids, all of those things. And a lot of times, okay, you're almost totally resistant to treatment. And then we have to deal with something that we're going to talk about in the next chapter called asymptomatic carriers. That's a real pain. People who don't demonstrate it but carry it. That's the saga of typhoid Mary, which I'll recount to you undoubtedly again. Okay. This is the plasmid. These are the methods. The one that we deal the most commonly with is something called conjugation. That's actually where I remember me talking about a pili called the fertility pilus, and it's like a hollow tube that can connect the two bacteria and it passes the genetic material. That way, they used to think it was some like male and female, like a sexual intercourse, but we know that bacteria are asexual. This is just a means of sharing or transferring genetic information. And this is just showing you some of their way of talking about these different mechanisms. I talked about, generating, making enzymes, creating alternative pathways, all of those types of things. And so this is any large population is going to have reason. It's why you and I there isn't a universal medicine for anything that we are. If we're exposed to drug-resistant population, we'll have a selective advantage. And there's a whole lot more bacteria than there are of us. I mean, you saw the numbers. They're vast numbers. Typically, the infecting dose for a salmonella infection would be in the order of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or 1 million that you would have to ingest. So you're already starting with big numbers. And then as they begin to replicate by binary fission exponentially, the numbers are astronomical. It is a numbers game that are there. And so, and you can't help it, they reproduce so quickly in the presence of those chemicals, you're going to create a certain amount of resistant forms. So what happens over time, they evolve to have the drug-resistant form as the dominant species. That's what I mean. We evolved things twice. We evolved Staphylococcus aureus at least twice to our knowledge so far. And so this is the idea. CDC in 2013, antibiotic resistant. So now we have to look for different things. Okay. Antibiotics are not economically lucrative. I didn't write the article. I didn't write the PowerPoint. I mean, this is common knowledge. And ultimately, and I can imagine they're going to have some additional legislation eventually be passed that will financially favor. It takes 7 to 10 years to get a new agent to the market through a lot of expensive testing. And then companies have a limited window of roughly 10 years to make money on it before generics. So, it's a business, ultimately. And you have to understand the workings of the business. When I was making a change between private practice and teaching, I was strongly thinking about going into being what they call a medical science liaison. Someone comes to talk to doctors about the science behind it. It's a business. I mean, not that you're going to lie to them, they're smart people, but you're trying to persuade them to use your thing, okay? So it's very time consuming and expensive to develop. Look at some of these. C. diff. Those enterobacteria that are resistant. Neisseria, we used to be able to have penicillin would treat gonorrhea. Now we have things. Acinetobacter is a wound infection that's very nasty to treat. What kind of brought it to this country? Our soldiers over in Iraq is where they were getting a lot of those infections. Campy, Campylobacter is in our gut. That are a problem. Diflucan-resistant candida, ouch. And then all of these different ones that are resistant, these different kind of streptococcal, clindamycin, like I said, I use it a lot for things like that. So these are some of the new approaches. I won't go into that for this class, and I'm not talking about CRISPR systems or anything like that. So we're good. Bacteriophages are sort of a wave of the future. This is all nothing I would test you about. So you can take a look at this. This is a good idea. Probiotics, prebiotics. I don't know about fecal transplant. Sounds kind of gross to me, but I digress. Thank you. Goodbye. See you Wednesday. We'll start a new unit. We're starting chapter 10 in Cowan, chapter 11 rather in Cowan then.